factors and ranking, and a little bit about SearchTides first before we get into actual ranking factors. But SearchTides, we're basically a hub for all things SEO, and we're a hub for all things organic search. And as a company, the way that we kind of think about things is we specialize in having a really data-driven approach to everything, but also um, we have an agency arm also, and as you're seeing today, we have a lot of different pieces of information for. Yeah, I'm noticing that the chat is disabled. I don't know, Derek, if you have the ability to turn that back on or turn it on in the first place, or if not, all good. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can make you. All right, I've made you co-host, so now you should be able to turn that on. So a little bit about SearchTides. So basically, we are a hub for everything that is SEO in the industry, and we have a pretty data-driven approach, and we'll talk about that today. So ranking factors in general, this presentation is kind of going to discuss what are ranking factors, why are they important, what do people get wrong about ranking factors, and then how we actually use them to generate insights, and then 3 massive ranking factors that you can use in 2024, and then we're going to end with how to write headlines and when to capitalize on them. So first things first, though, we're going to get into what ranking factors are. And it's kind of like this straightforward thing. And of course, straightforward doesn't mean easy to do or conquer. Simply enough, like Google's algorithm. And for this conversation, we're going to say the word Google, but we mean any search engine, we mean any LLM. So any sort of model like that, what they are doing is they're using predictability as well as like algorithm weights to generate a bunch of factors. And then they add all those things up together and you get a score. And this is basically called your ranking factor score. In SEO, this is what's going to get your actual result. In this example here, you have the quote unquote ranking factors of your score on homework, your score on your midterms, your score on your lab quizzes, and your final exam. Those are all of your ranking factors. They get added up, and then you get your final score, which in this case would be, a ranking in a search engine or a response as an LLM query. So this is what some ranking factors would actually look like in terms of organic search. So that it is a more dialed in specific. We're looking at things that are happening on page 1. We're looking at things that are happening most times on page 1. And then we're looking at a statistical correlation, which we'll talk about why that's bananas and honestly very wrong a lot of the times. So with that, like, the idea of ranking factors isn't actually new. If you were to go to, say, Google and type in Google ranking factors right now, you'd see a lot of content on them. In fact, there are some famous studies we're going to look at that came out about ranking factors. And ultimately, the challenge is not knowing whether or not this stuff exists, but the challenge is how to not look at this stuff in the wrong way. There's really kind of like a lot of hurdles and obstacles that you can misinterpret and get in the way. And what everybody seems to be doing is they seem to be taking a bottom-up approach. They're kind of taking an upside-down approach. They're going into different dimensions. They're building houses upside down, and things are exploding upside down. So they're just ultimately doing it backwards. And we're going to get into 3 examples right now of what that actually looks like. So this is one example from Backlinko, which is a fantastic publication. They put a lot of great content within SEO on there. This is their article. You can see it's got 50,000 shares. It's talking about Google's 200 complete ranking factors. And they're basically saying, hey, how did we get this information? We got this from looking at the results of SEO experiments. We got this from looking at Google patents. And we got this from looking at other SEO articles. We put this together, and we were able to look at sort of all these different factors. The problem with doing it this way is building from the bottom up means that there's a list of 200 ranking factors according to this article, when in reality, we know that there's over 4,900 ranking factors, even that we're looking at ourselves. So when you build from the bottom up, you come from a group of only one as opposed to a full top-down approach. And in terms of sort of like, hey, if you're looking for links to these articles, we see a couple questions coming in about that. Just kind of Google, backlinko, Google's 200 ranking factors. That'll get you to this article. If you're looking for links to this deck, we'll talk about that more at the end. So this is sort of the problem with one approach. Ahrefs, which is a blog that we love, and it's a product that we use. It's one of our favorite SEO tools. They had a post out that was like, hey, these are 7 confirmed Google ranking factors. And so the approach that they're taking is, we know this to be true because it was said by Google that it's going to be true. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that just because something is important over here doesn't mean it's important over there. And Derek, maybe you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, and also that confirmed means that Google has necessarily they've said yes, that's a ranking factor, right? And then there's, well, we're actually measuring hundreds and thousands, hundreds to thousands of different factors. There could be more actual factors, and Google's never going to confirm each one of those. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. So if you're working from a bottom up approach, you're only going to get a piece of the picture, and you're also not going to have the context here. For example, some ranking factors would be really important in a local search, and they would be not important at all in a national search. So I think the last kind of bottom up approach that we can take a look at today is in SEMrush, and they came out with a study in, I think, actually like December 2023 or January 2024, and they looked at 16,000 keywords. They looked at 100 search volume minimum per month, and they looked at the top 20 positions. So they basically looked at the first 2 pages. The challenge with doing it this way is that just because something correlates doesn't mean it's the same thing as it causes it to be true. And I know, Derek, that we have a lot to talk about that as well. And you also see some of the issues with this is that it is happening in terms of the top 20 positions. It's kind of like a relatively small sample size.
yeah, well, this is a top 20 correlation. Yeah, so it's very, very small sample size for each keyword. But also the way that they've kind of lumped everything together, it's like text relevance, which is an entire universe, right? Like that's like there's sections of that are actually relevant, sections that aren't relevant, right? And then just little things like the use of like star ratings or something like that is how that's like more correlating and more importance than actually having a strong domain or authority score and stuff like that, which is like this is where we actually talk about things where how correlation and causation aren't necessarily the same thing. There's also things of barrier to entry types of correlations and stuff like that, right? So not everything's going to not all ranking factors correlate. Definitely the most powerful ones don't actually correlate. So
Right. So basically, what you're saying is, if you're looking at a sheet of data and that's generating your SEO strategy, we all love this idea of being data driven, but a lot of times that's actually going to be counterintuitive.
yeah, exactly.
Okay. And so I think kind of like a follow up, one of the challenges with doing it this way, and these are actual recommendations and findings from these articles. And again, these are great publications. They put out great content. So it's just saying, like, it's the challenge with doing things a certain way. That's all that this is a conversation about. Like using HTTPS. Okay. Domain authority is important.
Yeah.
Update your content frequently. Organic traffic matters. Have a table of contents. These are things that if people saw them, it wouldn't be new information for anybody.
Yeah, and also it's not going to give you any kind of advantage, right? It's like, having HTTPS is not going to give you an advantage. It's a disadvantage to not have it because everyone else has it, right? So, and just having, say, old content, something from 2016, why is it not ranking? I don't understand. It's like, it's not, the advantage is where's the borderline of those frequency updates and stuff like that. That's also very important. A lot of things are niche specific as well. So, table of contents, sure, it helps. Like
yes. So does writing words, like having
yeah.
content on your page is a good thing too. And we're joking about this stuff, but really the big picture that we are saying is that everything is in relation to what your competition is doing and what the top results on the search engine results pages are doing. And so one of the challenges when you kind of like are doing this bottom up approach is that what we talked about before, just because there's data, that doesn't necessarily mean something. We're going to go into examples of that. On that point, just because something correlates doesn't mean it's the cause of it. Really, what you need to do is look at data and then create a testing hypothesis, which is what we're going to go through a live example of something that we did that. And the other thing is, search results matter depending on what you're doing. If I'm in my car on my phone looking for a restaurant, literally the distance from that restaurant from my phone is going to be a massive importance. The ratings of that restaurant are going to be a massive importance. If I'm on my computer looking for car insurance, those things are drastically different weights. So just because something is one way once doesn't mean it's another way another time, which means you kind of have to look at these. You have to have the ability to look at things individually as opposed to just in the aggregate. So there's a question coming in that basically says, like, how do I accurately analyze what my competitors are doing? And I think that there's 3 different ways that you can do this. So one of the ways that you can do this is you can kind of just look at things from the perspective of metrics. And that would be if you were looking at these sort of ranking factors, you would see the factors that your competition has. That's more technical than it needs to be. The other way to do it, and Derek, maybe you can give a brief overview, kind of like a preview of this, and then we can get more into it later on, is kind of actually looking at your competition's pages for conceptual things that they're doing. And so maybe you just want to talk for a couple seconds about what that means.
Yeah, well, I mean, and just in terms of, like, to back up like certain factors, like there's ways of if your technical level is good enough that you can use tools like Screaming Frog or even anything like that and just start measuring a specific thing on a page. Like if they're putting a keyword in the title, you can extract all your top 100 competitors and very easy accurately measure if there's a keyword in the title, at the front, the back, the middle, anything like those things, and do a correlation basically with Excel, and you can correlate to see whether or not, if having the keyword at the beginning of your title tag is more important than the back of the title tag. And that's a very, very small or exact measurement of how to do a single correlation, right? And all you would be doing is something like that, and then rinse and repeat, and then eventually you get into like more powerful tools and stuff like that that can actually do thousands of different of those variables at once, right? And then also what we're talking about is like a lot of things that we're having. It's very difficult to measure right now, and things that are like in the helpful content update, and like where your answers are on the page, like is that more important, and different things, who's saying what in the content, all these things are a little bit difficult to measure, and we have to kind of almost manually correlate these things, or just at least rip it apart, the top answers or the top queries, and form a thesis there and then test them, and sometimes correlation doesn't work always at all. So
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And a lot of times it's just there's nothing wrong with looking at a website and seeing what they do and really putting on your thinking cap and moving away from just trying to quantify things. Typically, there's not one little thing that you're missing, and if you tie the you implement it, all of a sudden everything changes. It is that case in the really hyper competitive spaces that we wind up playing in when you're at the top of the search results, and it is kind of like your every inch matters. But for most people, kind of what you're saying, Derek, you can just you can look at things visually and analyze conceptually what's going on, and that's incredibly vague. We'll get into we will get into a specific example of that. So the next sort of thing that we're going to talk about is just how do we actually do this? Like step by step, what's the example of us doing this, how we think about it, and what all that means. So for us, the first piece is to gather the data, and then we form our own hypothesis or our hypotheses. We test it in the field, and then if we're having conversations about clients, then we roll it out with clients. So in terms of what it actually looks like, gathering the data, like Derek, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what's going on first of all, on this slide, and I'm just gonna kind of load up these sorts of bullet points for you, but like, what is going on with ranking factors? I'm looking at something that's a lot of blue and a lot of red and a lot of numbers and some green. What are we looking at here?
Yeah. So, firstly, this is a screenshot from a software called Quora, and it uses correlation software, just kind of like some thing we could do manually with just by measuring a variable and extracting it across all your competitors. This it does it a little bit more on a larger scale, right? And one of the things, this was a post helpful content update, which was in September. And a lot of things that we were measuring started to exit. They stopped correlating, right? So were they less of a ranking factor or not? They're probably still ranking factors, but they're just so minute that they don't really correlate anymore. Or also that they have they're just standard practices now, right? So for you to find, for example, a URL that doesn't have a canonical, which was in the right there has a canonical URL, is very unlikely, right? Come back 5 years ago, a lot of people didn't have canonicals. Like it was just not a standard practice, right? And a lot of people weren't using them. It was kind of it was kind of leading edge almost, like only more advanced people would use canonicals or understand even what they were. Same thing with a lot of schema practices, meta description, title tags, all this stuff like that. They the use of them was more optional, right? But now it's more mandatory to even be in Google, right? So like if you want to be in the top 100 and you don't even have a favicon, like good luck, so like most likely what's happening here is that we're only seeing like the top 100 usually of a search query when we have hundreds of thousands of people trying to compete for a term, and we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, right? So all these things don't necessarily need to correlate because you're only looking at the top 100, right? When if you actually saw the entire pool of people competing for this term, like if you were actually able to correlate down 30,000 URLs that have this people the same keyword and the same title, they're competing for this, then you have a whole different level of different correlations. And there's going to be people in there that don't have favicons. There's people that don't have canonicals, all this stuff like that. But the
Right.
entry has risen so high for a lot of these terms that they just don't correlate anymore, right? So it's like if
Yeah.
like having a keyword in on your page, it doesn't correlate that well anymore. Keyword density doesn't correlate that well anymore, just because you wouldn't rank at all, So
Everyone already has it.
yeah.
And so what we're actually looking at here, and that's fantastic insight. And so what we know is that there's not 200 ranking factors, there's not 7 or whatever it is. Like there's over 4,800 right now that have a positive correlation. And the way that we are able to know that that is the case is because, again, you can use software and every single thing can be measured, as well as new ranking factors can be predicted kind of as they start to show up. And then you can run it against the database. So ultimately, and what we're actually looking at on this screenshot is we are looking in the name category. We're looking at a list of ranking factors, and then next to them is a category. So it either says relevance or other or authority. And then next to that is essentially a correlation rating that you don't have to know what it means. All of these are below a threshold to the point where for this pretend search, the results, to Derek's point, and the top 100, having these things don't actually correlate to your to your rankings. And so that's just what we're looking at here. And so this is something that we saw in the helpfulness update. Well, we started seeing the helpfulness updates from basically like late 2022. So the first thing that you need to understand is how to gather the data. And that's kind of what we've talked about here. It's like, how do you gather the data? You do lots of scraping on lots of search results pages, and you measure lots of factors. And by the way, you measure factors that don't exist in terms of they don't have a correlation yet also, and that gives you your baseline. Then you form a hypothesis with that. And one of the big things that we've kind of been hinting at the beginning, and Derek, maybe you can have some, you can kind of take some, you can go through this, is what is correlation and why, even though we talk about correlation and ranking factors, why can we also sometimes not have that be gospel.
Yeah, so like a basic correlation, say for example, if you took a like a bouncy ball, right, and you threw it in the ground, and you could measure the height that that ball measure jumps up every single time, and it would have like a perfect correlation saying that, you know what, if it keeps bouncing, it's going to stop, right? That's the correlation, right? And we can say, and and we can actually we'll take that and say, let's put it into practice and say, hey, like we can take this now, we can hit it harder and go up higher or lower, and we'll have the same kind of result, right? But we're manipulating the factors, right? Whereas something where the problem is just because one thing correlates with another thing doesn't necessarily mean that's what caused it, right? For example, if the name, I guess Alex, it's kind of with a weird I, it actually
Don't judge
correlates.
the Alexes. They're busy
Yeah,
jacking a lot of
I don't know,
cars.
it must be like a, well, I don't know. I grew up with the EX, or but carjackings in the USA, they actually have like a very strong correlation. So better not name your kid Alex because he's going to be a carjacker, right? Right. So, but the fact is that these two are just they have they just look alike. You know, like there's called spiralations, I think.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things like that too. Like that, I've seen ones where you know, the more apple pies you eat, the higher your suicide rate is, or something. You know, like you know,
Right.
like, so these things are don't necessarily matter. And this is also the problem with anytime someone releases a correlation study, and they're always like, well, correlation doesn't cause causation, and that's true, right? And so that's why everyone has to take upon themselves to start looking at things and saying, oh, this is the data we collected, and this gives us a reason to look at things, and then to test something with and actually prove something, right?
Yeah, and that's a great distinction. So everyone knows that apple pies are delicious and lead to happiness, but yet there could be this incorrect data piece around it. And ultimately, it's important to be able to have data and look at it, because if you don't have access to it, you are guessing. But then once you do have access to it, how do you make sure you don't treat it as the be all end all, and not put on your qualitative hat and kind of dig in a little bit further to it? So that's kind of like the next part of the process here for us, where we want to form a hypothesis. And Derek, you did a fantastic job kind of walking through one part of the hypothesis, which is, hey, there's all of these things appearing on this page in terms of ranking factors that no longer supposedly correlate with rankings.
Yeah,
But we know that is wrong, because we know that you should have schema on your page. We know that you should have variations of different parts of the components of your pages. We know that having a fav icon is actually a ranking factor, but this is just one of the things that is now everybody's doing it. On the
yeah,
flip side of it, this is also telling us that because these things are less important, since everybody's doing it, now there's going to be something else that becomes more important because not everyone is doing it yet. And that's kind of like, if relevancy and some of these other things matter less, what's the thing that's actually then going to matter more? And, similarly here, if there's fewer, said differently, if there's fewer rankings that have a meaning, what are the fewer rankings that now have a larger positive correlation with that? And so what we could take away from this is that there are quote unquote new ranking factors or different ranking factors that are actually more important. So in terms of our hypothesis, this is how we're using data to form some hypotheses about what is possible and what is no longer true and what could potentially matter more. And the next step is, well, we're kind of going blind in this process. So we need to kind of come up with our own set of analytics around what is working well. And so, Derek, maybe you just want to talk a little bit about like how we actually did this in this exact instance, and share the lessons on how we think about these things and how we form new hypotheses and see what's actually working.
yeah. So this one is like results right after the helpful content update, and is a page that went drastically up. And when we put our regular, SEO glasses on, kind of thing like that, and take a look at the page, we don't really see a lot of things that are standing out to us in terms of like SEO like factors. Are like, oh, there's barely any keyword density or any of this stuff, or the images not even using alt tags or whatever like that, right? Kind of stuff. So the traditional, a lot of the things that like the factors that are exiting and stuff like that were taking a play or role as much. Like this site might not even have a favicon. Who knows?
The gosh darn fab icon. And also, I'm going to cut you off for 1 second. So these are from some slides that we put out in a November event that we hosted. So you can, if you want to see these and see these examples, you can go look it up on our YouTubers on LinkedIn also. Sorry, please continue.
Yeah. So the thing that we were trying to do on these ones now is trying to find ways of looking at the data and start correlating things. And they're difficult things to measure because they're not going to be across all niches, right? Like, so this one, for example, is like how to get a doctor's no. And the things that started standing out to us was it's an actual walk-in clinic. So that the who of what is saying this was way more important than the actual content on it, right? So that their content in terms of how to get a doctor's note is merely it's identical to everyone else's impression of like or how to actually do it, but because it was a medical clinic that said it, that they're the ones that have the most experience doing that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden that performs a lot better, right? And the thing we
Who
have to
would
do,
be more appropriate than a medical clinic to teach you how to get a doctor's note?
yeah, exactly. And if we want to, we can actually could correlate this stuff. And the problem is we would have to take, say, like the top 100 people of sites ranking for this and go to each one of them and determine if it's a medical clinic or some kind of authoritative, like someone who's should be the ones telling you this, right? And and there's also a little bit more if you pull back about that is like who's the judge to say who's the authoritativeness on that, right? Right, right. So it's like, oh, this person has a PhD, right? But it's a chiropractor or something like that, so we don't like there's nuances in there which are very hard to measure, and so a lot of these factors they're going to be played out over time because it's just like a cumulative authoritative response with how people experience a page and how the user signals start applying things, right? So but we can definitely take correlation and try and figure out if the walk-in clinic it is a factor in this specific query. It's not going to be a factor on how to like write an ebook or something, right? Like
Right.
it's going to be different. So
And so you looked at a lot of these, and we looked at a lot of these, and we kind of saw a few different themes. So in this particular slide, the theme was about who was doing the talking was really important because that was kind of dictating whether or not that person was an expert. And an expert would be able to tell you exactly how to get a doctor's note because they literally are the types of folks who give out doctor's notes. Therefore, they'd also be speaking from a place of experience. They've written many doctor's notes, so they know why they write doctor's notes and why they don't write doctor's notes. And in a situation like that, that's being combined with stuff that would traditionally be seen as unimportant ranking factors for SEO. It's no alt tags on the images, just a couple lines of an answer. There's really like no meat to the page at all. And so what we found out from these was we kind of found from that first helpfulness content update, which is way back in the day before, before more updates became known, that there's really three things that are happening. Number one, it's a really big focus on experience. Number two, it's a really big focus on expertise. And number three, it's a really big focus on the efficiency of your content. It's not just about like, how do you get to the largest amount possible? And so, Derek, you kind of like dug around a lot, and you kind of figured these things out where like, yeah, experience and expertise matter a lot, efficiency matters a lot, and also the completeness of the information matters a lot. So in terms of how we're thinking about things, now we have our hypothesis. So first we looked at the data, And then we use the data to form hypotheses around something that became less important. And then in this case, we actually took a qualitative approach to determine things that became more important because we physically looked at these pages and these websites. And now we formed a hypothesis. And now the next step is for us to test this in the field. And the way that we actually did this was we created version one of this thing, which I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about in a second. Basically, it was like our guide to high quality content. This was a private SOP that stayed with us and we distributed to some clients of ours. But this was something that we put out in January 2023. The rest of the conversations around content helpfulness started to occur in like July in August of 2023. And you can kind of see here some of the topics that are being discussed about and that we're kind of creating information on how to do this. So, how do you take that hypothesis, Derek, or maybe how did you take that hypothesis and then convert it into testing it in the field? And how did that all kind of work together?
Yeah, and to know, like, we built this before even the helpful content update came out, right? So we're testing these things already because we knew that's the direction it was going, and then all of a sudden the big helpfulness update came in, and like, whoa. And the sites that we were implementing this in didn't get affected by helpful content. They actually went up. So even though some of the content in human eyes might be like, well, is it helpful or whatever, but we're still figuring out, like, Google is still just a bot, right? They're still measuring things, even though humans have a different perception of what certain things are helpful or not, right?
Mm.
Um, but Google's always going to take a shortcut. That's the secret to a lot of things. But so one of the things that we were looking at is like this. The problems with the version one of this was it was very much, can we make the most helpful piece of content, right? And the problem with that is that, like, it is very time exhaustive for a lot of things, which good content is supposed to be very time consuming. But in terms of reality, is we want to just be helpful more than the competitors. We don't need to build a 40-story skyscraper in a town of 3,000 people when everyone else is still just in little single-story buildings, right? Basically.
And Derek, can I just kind of elaborate on a couple key things that you said? So basically, our hypothesis is that, and this is back in December 2022, going on January 2023, that helpfulness and writing from a place of experience and writing from a place of expertise are really important to do. So if we do the most amount of that possible, we should be in a good place. So that resulted in this 32-page document that was like, here are literally all of the ways that you can do this. And also, here are all the ways that you can remove any fluff, which forces you to do actually more of this. And then what you're saying is, so that's putting it out in the wild. And the results from that was like, sure, if we had one person per page, per piece of content per day, this probably works. But that's not actually realistic. And so then we kind of had version two, which is, hey, we just have to do more of this than what's already happening in the search results for a given topic. And so now the testing it in the field is sort of changing in its attitude based on data that we're getting from going through this process.
Yeah, and a lot of things that carried over was like the number one thing that we did implement, and it still is getting, like, removing fluff, right? That's one that is we've been using ChatGPT and stuff like that to help identify that, and that's been a big game changer for most content, right? And I don't know how much we want to go into that, but um, where it's
Watch our
just,
videos on YouTube. We talk about it.
yeah, just basically, like, 10,000 words on a piece of content is just overkill, So
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so we're iterating is the point. We're iterating through this, and where we eventually landed was a happy medium between quote unquote maximizing our helpfulness within the bounds of what is reasonable and also what the upside is and also what the competition is doing. And so, number one, getting a comprehensive look at data is a difficult thing to do. You know, we kind of looked at a couple different examples of really well done publications, blogs respecting the industry trying to do it and just having challenges with their process and how they did it. The second challenge is then doing the opposite. Just because you have data doesn't mean it's the only thing that you do and it doesn't become, you know, your deity. The qualitative, the mental analysis component is actually really important for seeing what responds in the wild. And then you kind of need to be able to take things pretty far pretty fast. We were iterating once we had these ideas out there, and this is where kind of being able to do that is important. And it is a little bit scary because this is back in January 2023. There is nothing on the internet that is using the words helpful content. I don't remember what we called that document, but we certainly didn't. Helpful content was not in like the realm of language that was available. So there's not going to be that much material out there, but it's okay because a lot of SEO is more about a lot of SEO is more about being able to see what works for you and having a structure for how you can tell what works for you, and then being able to look at the data of what is working and not working for you, and then go from there. So that's just kind of an example on how we went through and actually did something. What we want to talk about now are three like pretty insightful ways that you can use the results of what we know about ranking factors in 2024. So let's just hop right into it. Number one, there is no SEO section of your page. The entire page is the SEO section. And essentially what that means is, and what we're looking at here is we're looking at a bunch of ranking factors that are called variations. That's basically just variations of language used. We don't have to go into more detail about that. That's also not an accurate sentence that I just said, but it's the variations of your keywords, your LSIs, your entities, where they're being, your relevance, where it's being used on the page. And what you can see here is that the different sections of the page are actually all showing up as ranking factors. So just because you have something in one part of the page doesn't mean that you have it in another part, and that means that you don't necessarily get credit in that other part if you don't have it. And the reason is, and Derek, I'd love to have you walk through this in the next slide. Most people think about, and when we are looking at keyword density on here and keyword frequency, I think what you can just, as you're watching this, what you can kind of just view this as is relevant language. Sometimes that's keywords. Sometimes that's LSIs or entities. Sometimes it's just topics of conversation that make sense to be on that page. Most people think about it like this, like I have the page, I need to have relevant things on the page, but actually this is what it is. This is how it is analyzed. And maybe Derek, you can go into a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, and in terms of just like keywords, usually like there's a few levels that we always talk about, which is say, like if you type NBA into Google, there's going to be a bunch of terms Google starts highlighting, right? So they might talk about National Basketball Association, NBA might be there. Basketball is a keyword and stuff like that. So those are all the first level basically keywords, and then we always have things like entities, which could be like basketball net or like the ball and stuff like that. All those things are all relevant in terms of language, right? And so when we're talking about the entire space is a little bit more of your SEO playground, and everyone who's ever worked with any clients has always been they've been given a section of a person's website or a page, and they go, yeah, put your SEO stuff kind of like here. It's underneath the first half of the page scroll or whatever, and it's the product description of your the e-commerce store. It's the the very limited space, right? And usually that stuff is not, it's worst case scenario. You can get some variations and keywords and stuff in those things, but the actual optimization of a page has to be done for the entire page, right? Like how you distribute your content and how the relevancy plays through the entire page, right? Like we're looking at the paragraphs, the headers, the actual navigation, the sidebar. All these things are weighed in terms of relevancy. So even having like a sidebar, for example, you might have text or links to other documents on your or web pages on your website that aren't relevant to what they're talking about on the main page, right? So and that gets that it actually skews your data, and it says like all these things are getting scored into your relevancy, but it's taken away from your relevancy. So all that stuff needs to be on point. So that's one of the first things we always look at is just like how relevant is the supporting content to this page on the page? What does the navigation look like in relevance to this page? What are your what's your footer? If it's talking about sports in your main page, is your footer about sports or is it about you know, baking? You know, like so,
Right.
right?
Right.
Right. So all these things they take a huge role, and then we actually have the meat and guts of the actual article. That's also very important, but we have to talk about the whole ecosystem all around.
Absolutely. And so if we were kind of going to summarize what this is, we could call them content zones. We can call them zones on the page. You call them whatever you want. But basically, you need to have that relevance, as Derek said, throughout every part of the page. And this is why, and we make fun of it, but it's, you know, we do it in jest. This is why a lot of times H1's at the bottom of the page, SEO sections don't work. It's not that that doesn't work. It just means it's really easy for your competitors to do anything better. All it takes is your competition to have an H1 at the top of their page, like a normal website, and now you're at a massive disadvantage. All it takes is your competitor to have content dispersed throughout its page. Doesn't even matter if it's good or bad content. Now it's going to rank better than your content that's in one section at the bottom of the page. So ultimately, like, everything theoretically can work. It's all about what everyone else is doing. But from our perspective, our advice is to think of your entire page as being relevant or not to what you are writing about, and answer the question yes or no. If not, it shouldn't be there, especially if you look at your competition and they do have that. And that's really what we want to teach here. It's like these things, you use them sometimes, you don't use them sometimes, but so much of SEO is about analysis of what is happening outside of your website and why your website is not at the top. And we're trying to give you the keys on how to be able to perform that analysis and know what to apply. And that's ultimately what's going to make you generate the best results. If we were to use an example where we are looking for the same keyword, and again, this is a hypothetical example to just show how this would work. If you were to look at the page source, right-click a page and do view page source, and you were to type that word in, what you would be looking for is for that word to appear across the whole source page. Because what shows up in the body of the page is not the entire thing. It also is about what shows up in the head of the HTML and the body of the HTML, the parts that aren't human visible. And so the left example over here, you see whatever's being searched for is showing up a lot. On the right example is showing up at the very top, and then it's showing up on the very bottom. So you can see how this concept, the left example, is going to perform better because it has more consistent distribution. Your takeaway should be, how do I create more consistent relevance throughout my entire page?
Yeah, and this is applicable to usually your exact match, your keyword variations, your relevance, your LSIs, everything, right? So, and even say like we'll see like bolded text, even though it's like if all your bolded text is all stuck at the top of the page and it's not scattered up through, then it usually gets it loses the advantage.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So the second big insight that we have is that first impressions matter most. And because we're really, really talking about first impressions, we're actually talking about stuff in your code. So you can see here some ranking factors, and they're talking about the top 30 kilobytes. Ranking factors that are saying what is going on in the top 30 kilobytes of your website. It sounds pretty crazy. It's also confusing what that might be. Let's go through an example of what that actually is. So how do you take the first 30 kilobytes of your page? You can go back to your source code. So you right click, you do view source code. And then what I do is I just copy all that, put into a file, and then I just start deleting until I get to 30 kilobytes. Maybe that's not the best way to do it, Derek. I don't know. Maybe there's a better way to do it than that.
The correct way to do it is just yeah, and some browsers are a little different, but like even like a Notepad Plus or whatever is very easy to do. You just paste your code in there and you just click at the top and you just drag your mouse down and it'll see how many characters you're actually at. And 30 KB is literally 30,000 bytes, right? So it's like that's how many characters there are. So and this is it sounds like a lot of space, but an inline CSS can literally take all of that up in one swoop, right? So a lot of people have messy code, and the reason it's important is it's Google's taking shortcuts, right? They want to know how relevant this page is to a certain thing, and they can start testing it in the algorithm for more things, but they want to have a quick kind of boost on, say, like, hey, this page is about sports, and we can tell that, and we just have to crawl the first little part of the page, right? And so those people actually get a little bit more. They actually have a better ranking. So
Yeah. And so the point here is it is more the same way that it's easy to just put a section of SEO at the bottom of your page. It's easy to, it's more difficult to have declarations of what your page is at the very top of your source code. And so some of you might remember Google PageSpeed's insights, where everybody got this thing called JavaScript, render blocking JavaScript. And everyone's like, we got to remove render blocking JavaScript no matter what it actually is. And so this could also potentially be a response to that, where like that's a proxy for having a bloated code base. And if you don't have a bloated code base, then you're way more likely to get the good stuff into the top of the top of the page. So one of the big challenges is you typically need like a product team to implement these sorts of things. And so what we recommend doing is, number one, buying gifts for product team and for development and stuff like that, because they're going to be your friends in this process, especially if you're working at a company that has any sort of size to it and you have different departments who are running different sort of platform pieces. And the second piece of advice that we have, Derek, and you can kind of go into this more, and I'll show you the next slide too. Here's kind of the before, where you just see at the top of the page a bloated code base. And this is like pretty typical for a lot of websites. And it's
yeah,
also pretty typical for somebody to say, hey, our product team is definitely not going to change our CMS for SEO purposes. And so what we've done is we've provided the guidance to kind of add in schema directly under the header. And this is what it'll look like, but maybe you can talk more about that.
yeah, and also, like, one of the easier fixes also is, like, if you're on just WordPress, a lot of times you just switch your theme to something that's less bloated, right? So a lot of bloated themes are out there. They're not fast, all that stuff like that. So a lot of things can just be handled with that, and also avoid using a lot of page builders, because page builders, well, anything that they look good, but generally they have a lot of code going into there. And so you want to test and experiment with different ones. And if you build like a page in some kind of like Beaver code. I can't remember. We don't use WordPress that much anymore, but any of those, and you like the way it looks, just pay a programmer to like hard code it or something, right? So you can get rid of a lot of the page code on there. But the schema is one of the ways that we can get structured data into the head, or it's going to signal Google, well, at least what the page is about, and we won't have to worry so much about the CSS and stuff like that. It's not going to be optimal in terms of like how much keyword density you get in the top 30 kilobytes, but at least you're getting something in there, because something checking off the box of having the correct terms in your top of your head is an important, very important, strong factor. So at least getting a 1 is a lot better than a 0 in terms of a lot of these factors.
So you're saying that, something is better than nothing, basically.
Yeah, and that's the way we look at a lot of ranking factors. It's not like how much you have of everything, but how much can you get into all the different factors, right?
Right. The top ranking factors are literally how many ranking factors are you using. So like, just for everybody out there, going on with witty one-liners, our third
Yeah.
big insight that you can use is less is often more. And essentially, we're going to just talk on that. A couple of questions are coming in. What tools do you use to scrape data that you really like for hypothesis? I think probably the most complex one is going to be Cora for sure, which we've mentioned before, Cora. I think in terms of like on-site optimization for content, Surfer is probably pretty good for that. I don't know, Derek, if you have some additional. Surfer's one that is maybe a little bit more front-end friendly, but maybe you have some additional recommendations too.
They're a little more content focused now, so it's like mention your keywords and stuff like that. It's really helpful. And if anything that's new, say Screaming Frog is very important. Like someone on our team, Scott, started saying like, hey, this use of main tag is being used and it's correlating pretty well, and it's very easy to extract using just Screaming Frog to go, you get your top 10, 100 results, and then check to see who's using this main tag, and then see if it correlates. And that's one of those things where it's like not a lot of people are using it, and so it correlates, and it's actually an advantage. And when we tested it, you optimize it, and we had ranking improvements. Using this main tag was an advantage, right? So until everyone starts using it again, and then it's just a canonical tag, right?
All right, so y'all can use use some main tags and stuff. I think ultimately we kind of are building instructional videos on how we use our most favorite tools. And so come into our ecosystem and keep your eye out for those, because I think one of the things that we've just gotten feedback from is, hey, it's great to get a list of the tools that you use, but what we're really interested in is literally how you use them specifically. So more to come there. I want to make sure that we have enough time to go through everything. So I think in terms of the less is more approach, number one, if you have more words on the page, it is going to be more difficult to keep your keyword density, because you are going to have those words appearing way more than everybody else. So for example, if everybody else has 1,000 words written on the page and you have 5,000 words, in order for you to have the same density as everybody else, you have to have keywords and you have to have relevant words 5 times more frequently occurring than everybody else, which, by the way, is going to move you off of that correlated metric for it. So this is what leads down a pathway of a lot of content sounding very, quote, optimized for SEO and really not like friendly. And along those terms, Derek, the mentality of skyscraper is something that we don't necessarily see any value in anymore.
Yeah, and I think DED is the new spelling for dead, but
Oh, that was on purpose. DED, dead.
yeah, and it's more of like the mentality and the way that was like Brian Dean was the inventor of skyscraper content, which was basically build a bigger, better version of everything, right? And it's honestly it's just the way people think of things, which it's the concept has changed where now it's just like, oh, bigger was always better, but it's not, right? So a bigger page is not better. Honestly,
Totally.
more we think of things like value per word, which is like, can we get to the points more quickly? Can we be helpful to the user? That's going to be the better skyscraper tactics, right? Like if someone comes to this page, are they able to finish their search query basically there on your site because you satisfied it, or do they have to go back to the search results and do it all over again because
Right.
we couldn't? So and it obviously it trumps things like dwell time, right? Dwell time was a ranking factor that's a lot of people are just like, oh, you got to make sure they're on your website long enough, but they could just be on your website for a long time because they're confused, right? And then, right, and then they're just trying to scroll, they can't find anything, and then so they're on their page for 5 minutes and they give up, and then they go back to Google and they just sent a massive negative signal to your site. So
Totally. And then in addition to that, I want to make sure that we kind of get through all our slides here. So the scrollability test, maybe you can spend 15 seconds talking about what that means.
yeah, so today in this generation, our attention spans have been tweaked to uh, enjoy more short form content, TikTok and YouTube Shorts and Instagram Reels and stuff like that. So, and a lot of that translates over into longer form content, which it needs to be is that can I give 20 seconds basically to a page and kind of understand and figure out what this page is about just by scrolling things, looking at the headlines, the bullet points, the images that are being used there. It's less about the actual text and more of like the aesthetics of the page. And does that look like a page I want to actually interact and spend more time on?
And that's a great point. And so we had a question come in that says, well, what about really technical B2B content, which we need long spaces to communicate? And especially with scrollability, we're not saying don't say the things that you need to say. What we're saying is structure the page in such a way where that someone is scrolling through the page at a fast clip and they are actually able to see the different things that they may want to stop on and then do a deeper dive of learning and reading on. And ultimately, that is a different function than just having paragraph, header, and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of the broad strokes on some of the things and how we think about ranking factors and how we analyze them. Search Tides, we're opening up a hub for all things SEO for the entire industry. All content is free for the time being, but that means sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media. If you want to work with us directly about stuff, kind of like an agency style thing, you can get in touch with us that way. But LinkedIn, we're at SearchTides. YouTube, we're at SearchTides. The website is searchtides.com. If you're noticing a pattern here, we got some questions before about, hey, can we get some of these guides? Can we get the deck from this presentation? The answer is yes, but you must be on our newsletter and you must respond to one of our newsletter messages and say, hey, I'd like this thing. Hey, can I get this guide? Hey, can I get this deck from this presentation? Next time, the price to get these things for free is going up even higher. So get in before the price goes up. For Derek Wozniak, I'm Greg Brooks. Thanks so much for spending your valuable time with us. We hope you learned something today. Any questions that you have, just fire away. We're out on the internet. You can find us. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thanks, everybody.